My name is Marc Singer. Welcome back to the Basics. This is part of the GGU Present series. I am Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies at Golden Gate University, and I am thrilled today to be able to welcome Janiece Evans-Page to talk with us. Janiece is the Chief Executive Officer of Tides, and she's leading the organization as it seeks to broaden the reach of its impact and deepen its commitment to social change with dynamic tools, deep expertise, novel collaborations, and innovative ideas. Some of you may know Ms. Evans-Page is an alumna of Golden Gate University, which I guess we'll be talking about in a little bit. She previously served as the inaugural Chief Sustainability and Diversity Officer at Fossil Group and head of Fossil Foundation. She launched Fossil Group's global philanthropy practice, and we'll be talking about that a bit today, generally. And she was also, and this really means a lot to me, the architect of Fossil Foundation's signature initiative, which is empowering youth through innovative partnerships with social entrepreneurs, which has impacted the lives of over 1 million underserved young people around the globe. Before that, she was at Hewlett-Packard and was Vice President and General Manager of HP. She turned their imaging and printing attach organization into a $600 million plus global enterprise. And she currently serves on the boards of Southern New Hampshire University and IDEO.org. The thing that I first learned about Janiece, and I could go on, I should probably stop and ask questions at some point, but was that in 2018, she was honored by Ebony Magazine as one of its Power 100 awardees in the Women Up category. And this year, she was honored at the 12th annual Powerful Women of the Bay Awards Luncheon. And as I mentioned, she got an executive MBA from Golden Gate University here in San Francisco and has a bachelor's from the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome, Janiece. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mark, and I am so thrilled to be here. And much gratitude to you all for reaching out to me and reconnecting me with Golden Gate University, which truly has a special place in my heart.
That's great. Well, in fact, why don't we talk about that a little bit? How did you end up at Golden Gate, and what was that experience like for you?
So hopefully we have enough time for me to talk about my history. But I will say, I mean, my path of getting there is one where I knew a little bit about Golden Gate, but early in my career at HP, I already knew that I wanted to go back and get my master's, my MBA in particular. But I also knew I didn't necessarily want to leave my full-time job to do so. And in having a conversation with one of my supervisors, and this was early in my career, so I was maybe two years in at HP and started getting, those initial promotions that start to happen. And my boss had asked me in terms of my development and seeing potential, would I be interested in starting an MBA program that fall? And this was like June. And so, of course, my answer was like, yeah, absolutely, right? But I'm not thinking that this is going to happen like now, right? When he was saying that fall. So I remember him saying, I'm an alum of Golden Gate, and I'd love to connect you with the dean there. Would you be interested? And so I'm like, again, the right answer, to your supervisor is like, oh, of course. So next thing I know, the next day he said, okay, you have a meeting with the dean next week. And I'm like, oh my God, right? So when he was speaking to, am I interested in getting my MBA and would I be open to doing it that fall? I kind of was like, okay, he's being nice, right? And so I go and have the conversation with the dean. And the next thing I know, a week from that, I was asked to actually, submit the application and I was in. So it was a crazy path, but I did know a little about Golden Gate. I didn't know a lot about Golden Gate. And I think the other thing that was important to me at the time is after having gone to Berkeley as an undergrad and had a great experience, I was very clear that I didn't want to go to a Berkeley-like institution for my MBA. I really wanted to go somewhere where I could get those hands-on skills, if you will, and not that you don't get that from, Haas or any of the other MBA programs, but I knew I really wanted that hands-on business insight, if you will. And so that's where I did start doing some research on Golden Gate. And what I loved was the fact that most of the professors were extremely successful executives and professionals, if you will, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And my thinking then too was that I was going to, continue working in the Bay Area in some capacity. So I loved, one, the fact that these were working professionals in many cases who were teaching the courses in the MBA program. And two, it truly had a great reputation amongst the kind of the professional elite throughout the Bay Area. So once I got that ask, and then the answer was yes, next thing I know, I was starting an executive MBA program that fall. So it was a perfect match for me. I loved the cohort, the cohort approach. I was probably one of the younger people in my cohort. Most of the folks that were part of my cohort were already successful, either doctors or engineers or you name it. And I think it was me and one other person who were really the younger folks in that cohort. And initially that was a little intimidating for me, but I knew, the great news with the executive MBA program, as you know, is that you kind of go through all the different aspects of business. And where I was actually really able to shine was when we got to the organizational development work, when we got to the marketing work. I mean, those were my things, definitely. So anyway, I found my space and my place in the executive MBA program, but I will say initially I was like a little overwhelmed, with the power, the powers that were around the table in our cohort. But as you well know, with the program of this sort, everyone becomes fast friends and lifelong friends as well.
Wow, I'm glad we recorded this because that's our next commercial right there. I couldn't have said any of that better myself. That was great. Well, I know we do, and we won't talk too much more about this, but that scholar practitioner model that's really focused on working folks who want to get their hands dirty, I think is really the hallmark of the program. So it sounds like it was a real benefit to you and what you were interested in at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's great. So from there, I know you went from there. You've been doing a lot of work in corporate philanthropy, working on diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives, community engagement work, with some of the organizations I mentioned before, Fossil and HP. And so now you're the new as of January, I think, right? CEO
Yes.
of at Tides. So how did you get from this executive MBA into social impact work? And how are you finding that to be different from the work you did before?
Yeah, I sometimes say that I have this kind of crazy unicorn kind of blueprint in terms of how I got here. So let me kind of speak to that journey. And now, I don't want to say being older, let me just say being more experienced. I can kind of tell you what that path looks like or has looked like. And that some of the things I know now as truths in terms of who I am were definitely there early in my HP career. But it was always part of my my own true north was to make the biggest impact possible. And one of the things that attracted me to HP coming out of Berkeley as an undergrad wasn't so much that I was enamored with technology. It was really more about HP's reputation, if you will, of making a difference and the power of what technology could do to change lives. So that was more of my interest in HP, was about the power of technology, not so much just technology in and of itself. And obviously HP then had a great reputation, still does, just in terms of culture building, et cetera. So that was my, my on-ramp in terms of going to HP, but it was always still part of my own purpose of making the biggest impact possible. And I remember some early conversations I had even with folks at HP, but even beyond that, of kind of what would success look like for me, and all of us early in our career have these conversations about what would this look like 10 years out or 20. And I would tell you, I always said it was making the biggest difference, in someone's life, right? Making a big, and so it was always hard for people like, well, how is she here at HP and technology, et cetera? But I always knew for me, it was about making a difference. And so even, in my early career and later career at HP, because I'll speak more to that later, when I was even on the P&L side or, leading marketing teams or all the different things I did, I was always plugged into other things that HP was doing at large around community engagement or DEI work in terms of how we were starting to mentor and hopefully grow the population of Black and Brown employees, et cetera. And so I was always very clear, even with my bosses, that in addition to my day job, I wanted to be engaged in some of these other initiatives at the company, whether that was diversity and inclusion, et cetera. So, and I always made sure that somewhere that would show up in my performance plan as well in terms of my contribution to the company's success beyond just my day job in these other areas. And so it was really having an opportunity, if you will, both at HP and even in the community that later prepared me for, I think, the work that I do now. And so I'll, later kind of speak to how I was able to kind of move in and out of kind of P&L responsibilities at HP into corporate affairs, doing strategic philanthropy, and then back into the P&L space, but always still being very intentional about, okay, how are we going to make an impact in people's lives, right? Beyond just selling technology to, for-profit companies and even to our consumers. And so a unique opportunity presented itself when Carly Fiorina was CEO, where HP made a pretty bold commitment to invest over 5 million, or at the time was 5 million, into East Palo Alto. And the initiative was through the e-inclusion. We called it e-inclusion work, and creating and hopefully building a strategy around what we call digital village. And so I ended up being the first employee hired to come lead that work. And in doing that, HP's commitment wasn't just to come in and dump technology, if you will. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with that. It was not just about donating product. It really was about system change, right? And to work initially with the community of East Palo Alto on how a company like HP, right, could invest technology resources and technology know-how to help the community of East Palo Alto improve their quality of life. And working with, different stakeholders from city government to school district to the small business community in really creating this system change throughout. And so I was the HP executive that was hired to come in and do this work. And for me, it was a dream job, right? Like I said, I always was very much connected to what the company was doing in the community, but then to actually leverage my business skills of having worked with, commercial customers, consumers, et cetera, and to use my skills from marketing to work with a community that looked like me, right? And to bring all of that forward, in the community of East Palo Alto. And so what started off as a job, I will tell you, was truly my passion. And I realized what it felt like to get up every day and not feel like you're going to work, and we have this conversation, especially with younger people and myself. I have 2 college-age kids right now, but how do you really lean into your purpose? And that when you're getting up every day and there's not this habitual thing like I'm going to work, right? And so anyway, it was a incredible opportunity to work, at HP, right, in this new space that the company was creating, and to be the first person kind of leaning in and creating this footprint for the company. And so what started off as one community, East Palo Alto, ended up scaling to many communities, East Baltimore, Fifth Ward in Houston, and a tribal community. And with that came promotional opportunities for myself to lead this then national footprint. And then the work went global, right? So as we were doing these projects throughout the US, and we initially looked at them as kind of pilot projects with the intention that we would ultimately scale, right? We knew everything we did wasn't necessarily going to be a home run, but how do we pilot these different interventions in these communities and then figure out what could we really do from a scaling perspective. And so, again, my team and I then had the opportunity to continue these pilots and then to identify an actual platform for the company to scale, which we did. So we looked at micro enterprise development as being an opportunity to scale across the globe, education, et cetera. So that's when I first had my real, my initial, I think, introduction to quote unquote social impact, because the work we were doing was not just about philanthropy, right? And it also introduced me to the space of social entrepreneurship, where I was like, oh my God, that's where I ultimately want to end up. Is I love the premise of entrepreneurship and using entrepreneurial business skills to solve social problems, and just the scrappiness and innovation that comes from social entrepreneurs themselves. So anyway, having the opportunity to do this work at HP, but also be introduced to these very innovative models of social impact and social change is what ultimately paved the way for me to do the work I do now. After that at HP, I went back on the P&L side, which was great. So, after Carly left the company and things kind of changed, in terms of the company's priorities, I had an opportunity to, got promoted again and went back on the business side to lead a new business initiative, which was great. Because I think even some of that paved the way for me to do what I do now, just in terms of leadership and, starting a business, within HP and growing, it growing to 600 million and just all the other stuff. I learned a lot about scaling, right? About system change and even about collaboration, right? That did pave its way for me to do this work. But I also then realized that ultimately my purpose was going to be outside of HP, right? So after going back on the business side and having this incredible opportunity to lead a business unit, I knew ultimately for me that next stage of my career would be to leave the company. And so you fast forward, and I guess it was good news I did. My husband then had an opportunity to assume a promotional opportunity with AT&T here in Dallas, which is how we got here. And not too long after coming here, I was then hired by AT&T to help them kind of pivot and transform their community engagement work. And the reason they hired me is, one, I had the P&L business background and acumen, but I also had done this quote unquote innovative community engagement work at HP. And so I was there for a short period at AT&T before I was then recruited to come start the social impact work and the foundation at Fossil. 7, 8 years in at Fossil, and last year, someone knocked at the door to see if I would be interested in this opportunity at Tide. So I often say, and I love having conversations, young people, everyone, about, okay, how did you get here? And I share all of this because it's not this one linear path, right? The great news now, and you think about Golden Gate and other universities, is that there are programs now focused on social impact. There are now incredible programs focused on social entrepreneurship, system change, et cetera. But when I graduated from Berkeley and even went to Golden Gate at the time, there was not a program that prepared you necessarily for the type of work I'm doing now.
Well, that's interesting you say that. I mean, it's something I was going to talk about with you later, but yeah, we're trying to figure out, how do you teach that in a class? Because you think about, there's that theory that's like, oh, the business of business is business, and you've been at places where they were open to thinking about this community engagement. But it's not every place is like that, and it seems like I mean, you have to make your own way to some extent as in that space. But the challenge for us, of course, I'll save that for later, is like, how do you make sure that students take that with them when they go, and they can do the kind of good work that you're sort of paving the way for, So now you're at Tides, as you said, as we were talking about, and so could you, if you don't mind, I'm getting my head around a lot of this. Could you just tell us about Tides and what the organization does now?
Sure. So I'm going to give you kind of, here's how we Tides kind of speak to what we do, and then kind of what's the real job that I do. And so Tides is a philanthropic partner and nonprofit accelerator dedicated to building a world of shared prosperity and social justice. And so we really work at that nexus of working with funders, and I'll speak more to that, as well as social ventures, right? And creating that type of system change that I talked about, right? Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because depending on what side of the coin you are looking at, right? The on-ramp to Tides is very different for all of our partners. And so when we speak to kind of the nexus, what do we mean, right? So we work with funders on one side. So whether those are individuals, so we have donors, right? And we have a donor advised fund structure in place. We work with corporate partners as well in terms of their social impact work. We work with social ventures, social entrepreneurs, if you will, where we have a fiscal sponsorship model so that nonprofits themselves do not have to carry, I don't want to say the burden, but carry the responsibility of their own 501c3, but we partner with them to build capacity, if you will, by providing support for their HR practices, their legal practices, and their financial practices as well. And then we also have a platform in place to provide physical support, is what I sometimes say, physical real estate support for nonprofits, both in New York as well as in the Bay Area and San Francisco, where we actually provide below market rates, leasing rates to nonprofits who actually rent from us in our physical structure. So we are very uniquely positioned, and we also do impact investing. So it's kind of an and. So we really are at that nexus of working with those on the ground, creating the real change and movements, as well as the funders on the other side. The great news, though, for us is we had an unprecedented year of success, and we'll talk more about success as well as challenges, because last year was a very challenging year for all of us in the social impact space, but success in the sense that our revenue exceeded 1.3 billion last year, which was a huge year for us. And right now, I share that because I think folks don't understand the scale and scope of Tides in terms of where we are in that ecosystem of social change. But we do, and we sometimes have been somewhat quiet, right? So when you think about Tides, and some people are like, I think I've heard of Tides, and so are you with Tides Foundation? I'm like, no, I'm with Tides Network, which includes the foundation, but also some of the other assets that I mentioned in terms of our real estate, et cetera. So we do play this really interesting role in the kind of ecosystem of social change. But I speak to there being this next chapter for Tides in the sense that one of the opportunities for us is to be more intentional about our point of view, right? So we do have a point of view as it relates to social justice, racial justice, climate justice, but how do we ensure that there's this through line throughout everything we do that kind of speaks that truth in terms of who Tides is? You know, how do we become not so much more visible, but how do we elevate our voice as it relates to impact, right? So revenue is an indicator of impact, but it is not impact in and of itself. So when you start thinking about our scale and scope, what role do we play in terms of impact of creating system change around social justice or climate justice, or a lot of the areas where we're playing? So that's kind of the next chapter of Tides that we're actually launching now, in terms of how do we now kind of take those forces and bring them together, and also to even be, I think, more intentional around our efforts and our abilities to collaborate with others who care about these same things that we care about.
You're really, like you said, it's a network. You're really building systems, and I think as you said before, crossing boundaries and creating all these links between all these communities in your work.
Exactly.
It's so important. It's so hard to explain that, though, too, isn't it? It's that's the challenge, I suppose.
Well, and what I'll comment on too is I think folks know about some of Tides projects, but they have no idea that Tides is, quote unquote, providing the platform, or that we're, quote unquote, enabling some of these efforts to happen. So case in point is one of them. I'm sure everyone on this call knows Black Lives Matter, right? We were the fiscal sponsor for Black Lives Matter until December, not for the entire life of Black Lives Matter, which launched years ago, but for a majority of 2020, we were their fiscal sponsor, providing that, quote unquote, 501c3 support. We actually still are the ones who manage the Black Lives Matter General Fund. So their fund is still managed at Tides, right? There's other initiatives that folks probably on this call may be familiar with, like TXO, which is a partnership that involves Andreessen Horowitz, that's focused on, quote unquote, providing support, if you will, in elevating Black and Brown led enterprises, if you will. And so we actually are the fiscal sponsor for that project. 110 is another one that several people probably know about on this call, which is also to ensure that we're providing support to enable and elevate the next generation of Black and Brown leaders in the corporate space. So we're the fiscal sponsor for that project as well. So there's a lot of these social justice, important social justice movements, initiatives that are happening and underway, but appropriately the headline isn't Tides. It's about these projects, but we are, quote unquote, the enabler or one of the enabling partners to help elevate some of these important initiatives. The other work that, again, is invisible to many is that we provide the philanthropic grant-making capability for Google Foundation. So Google does all the amazing work, Google Foundation, but we actually do all of their grant-making or manage their grant-making infrastructure. For Salesforce, I know most people on this call know Salesforce. We actually do Salesforce's, we manage Salesforce international grant-making, right? So we play this crazy cool role, right, across this ecosystem of social impact. And the list goes on and on. There's a host of other new emerging initiatives that we're involved in, as well as new corporate partnerships as well.
And this is probably not how you would describe it, but it seems like you're really helping these folks be better neighbors, better community partners. And it's so important, but I can see also how it would be tricky about not wanting to lead with, oh, this is a Tides project,
Correct.
This is something else. So you mentioned the pandemic, which of course is a question that I end up asking everyone at some point on these conversations, because that's why we're here now. So you mentioned that it's really had an effect on what Tides has been able to do this past year. Has it had any other effect? Like, has it changed your focus, or is that part of what's led you to think about how to tell this story in a different way? Would you say?
I wouldn't say it's changed our focus, because we were already truly positioned, right, as an accelerator of social change, right, and social justice in particular. If anything, it affirmed the importance of this work and the role that we Tides can and should play in this space, because as we all know, that these issues around social justice, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice were all exacerbated as a result of the pandemic, right? And what population or populations, of course, were most at risk and continue to be at risk, right? And when we think about the role or the impact of the pandemic itself, Black and brown communities, and say Black and brown women even more so, right? So the role that we Tides have played just became more visible and more intentional about needing to accelerate change and progress as it relates to social justice and racial justice and climate justice for that matter. So I know we are extremely, well, we are unapologetic about our view moving forward of what we call JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and needing to apply that lens to everything we do. So that's kind of part of that next chapter I talked about, but I will say the pandemic elevated the need for Tides and others in this space to hopefully accelerate progress in addressing a lot of these problems.
Yeah. Now, yeah, so it's really, the urgency of it has definitely stepped up a bit more, I would say.
The urgency, the criticality, not as if people didn't know racial injustice happens in this country, but I think because everyone was still last year, that the George Floyd and other murders that occurred made these issues even more visible, if you will. So anyway, I think for us Tides last year, I will say that we did attract some new funders and new partners who, not that they didn't understand before, but then realized, well, that this racial injustice conversation is extremely real, right, in terms of what's happening in this country, and looked to us Tides and others who are in this space to hopefully be a part of the problem solving.
So this is a sort of a broad question. And so I'm really encouraged to hear that companies are stepping up, organizations are stepping up and wanting to work with you. What is it that you're seeing that's motivating them? Like, why do they have these engagement arms, these giving arms? Or is there not any one reason that covers everybody?
So what I will say, having spent quite a bit of time, as you know, on the corporate social impact side, and kind of what's motivating them, what I used to sometimes say is, however a company gets there, they get there. Right? Yeah. For some, it is truly, capitalism, which is the motivation, right? Understand that consumers are becoming more educated in this space, and especially if you're talking about millennials and Gen Z, right? They are far more intentional about brands representing some truth other than just making money, right? So depending on a company's, focus and industry, some are getting there faster because they know their consumers care about it, right? Not that they don't, but they know that in order to stay relevant and to survive, this will have to be a part of their purpose, right? For others, there's the investment side of it. So, thinking about BlackRock and others who have been more vocal on these issues during the last 4 years about companies that receive investments from them need to have a strategy or a purpose around either climate justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, social impact, et cetera. So for some companies, that's a motivator. For others, it's already been a part of their truth, right? And so if you think about, there's a myriad of brands where it was always part of their truth to make the biggest impact possible, right? And so they were already, whether they were still on kind of the corporate philanthropy bandwagon or had started to kind of shift to what later was called CSR, corporate social responsibility, to kind of pivoting to social impact, to sustainability. Different companies are at different places on that journey. For some, last year was a wake-up call where, of course, if you look on LinkedIn, you'll see one of the #1 jobs is diversity, equity, and inclusion officers or directors or what have you, right? Is that authentic? It depends on the company. Depends on the company, right? And their motivation in that regards, right? So I will say last year was, for some companies, an affirmation, and for others, it was a confirmation, right, of how important social and environmental impact is.
Right. Wow. So I should mention, folks attendees are posting questions, and if you do have a question for Janiece, please post it in the Q&A. I want to ask a question here because it comes from somebody who I believe is a former classmate of yours from GGU, Robert Schaffner.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so he's here. So I have to ask his question.
I'm not looking, so I apologize, everyone on chat. I have not opened it up, but I promise I'll open it up. So a major shout out to Robert.
So Robert asks, so he says, Tides obviously is a leader in the foundation community. At this moment in time, how is Tides adjusting its programs and practices to better support racial and social justice and communities that are disproportionately impacted by inequity in grant making?
So how long do I have to answer that
Yeah.
question? Let me just say there's a lot that is underway. So what do I mean by a lot and how are we adjusting? Let me first say the answer is yes, we are evolving our practices from a grant making perspective. I will say, as I mentioned before, is that part of our executive team are new, but even for those who have been with the organization, we are all very much committed to several priorities this year, one of which, as I mentioned, is to integrate that JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to everything we do, which includes grant making, right? So I'll give an example, and hopefully this answers Robert's question, is one of the areas or one of the TIDES projects or programs is called TIDE Center, and that's our fiscal sponsorship effort, as I mentioned before, in terms of providing support for a multitude of nonprofits and social ventures. And some of those, if not most of those, are aligned, with, if you will, with social justice, climate, et cetera, right? If you look at who are the leaders of those organizations, right? It is not a surprise, as it's not across philanthropy, that a majority of them are not of color. Doesn't mean that people of color are not leading, but there is a huge body of work, and I have close friends who've been involved in some of the studies over the last couple of years of how there is this disproportionate gap in terms of funding resources for BIPOC-led nonprofits versus those that are led by our white brothers and sisters, right? So known facts, data is there, et cetera, right? So when you look at TIDES, our practices have mirrored some of that work. And my thing is, as a social justice organization, we need to change that. So it is one of our priorities this year, when you look at our TIDES Center projects, is making sure we're not exacerbating the problem as it relates to quote unquote racial injustice, in terms of looking at quote unquote who's in our portfolio, right? What's the criteria for being a part of our TIDES Center, and making sure that we're quote unquote being extremely inclusive in our practices. So if there's a threshold that says you have to have revenue of $250,000, is that the right threshold, right? For a BIPOC-led nonprofit or social venture to get to 250K is pretty significant jump. So is there a different approach that we should be looking at in terms of inviting partners to be a part of our TIDES Center work? So I use that as an example. When you think about our corporate social impact work, I will tell you that a lot of our new corporations coming to us are intentionally integrating DEI into their social impact strategy and wanting us TIDES to help them on that journey. So that too is an area that we are quote unquote doubling down on and investing in, is to make sure that our own staff is equipped to have those type of conversations with our new corporate partners. So it goes on and on, Robert, in terms of where we are. And I will say, when we have this conversation again next year, I think you will see some new efforts, some renewed efforts from TIDES in terms of our efforts around JEDI.
Oh, are you coming back next year? I would love to have you back.
I'd love to come back. I also will say too, is I'm really clear when we talk about JEDI, that this isn't even just about our partners. This is, and I mentioned this is also about our staff, right? So one of the things we're looking at too is we have a new chief people officer who is phenomenal. And so she too is making sure in terms of our culture, is that our culture speaks to, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? The other part of this though too is what's happening at the board level at TIDES. And so I'm crazy proud of our board. And our board, we just had a 3-day board meeting last week and spent quite a bit of time having a conversation about racial justice as well, and what's the implication for TIDES board. So we're ensuring that this is something that is integrated to all aspects of TIDES, at the board level, at the leadership team level, staff level, and also our partners.
Wow. So in fact, there was a question here where somebody asked if you could talk about your team. I guess I wonder how much they have an effect or an influence on what you choose to focus on, because there's just so much.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So that too is part of the strategy work, and I say that, so let me talk about the team in a second. But the great news about TIDES is TIDES has expanded over the years and continuously added on new products and services. Some of them have been responding to quote unquote, community or social needs, and in other cases, opportunity, right? And part of what the strategy work will help us with is to prioritize, right? So when you think about all the stuff we do, I'm not saying we're not going to continue all of that, but within that scope of work, there's some things we do extremely well, and maybe there's some stuff we don't do as well. And every organization, I'm sure, comes to that epiphany as well. And so as you think about that blueprint and all the things we do, what are the things that we should actually invest in because it's important to the social impact sector, right? What are the things that maybe we should sunset, not as important? So we're going to go through that effort. But in terms of our leadership team to help us, we are bringing in a strategy consultant, but also this is about building capacity within Tides. And so our leadership team currently includes myself, of course, but also we have a new chief people officer who I mentioned. She too started in January, so a week or so after me. We have a new chief partnership officer who will lead all of our work, all of our partnership work, whether it's the work with our corporate social impact partners or our individual donors, all the way through to working with our social ventures as well. So he too is new to our leadership team. He's based in New York. So Dan Shannon is our new chief partnership officer, and that too is a new role at Tides. And then we have chief financial officer who, another superpower within the organization when you're talking about our scale now over $1 billion, a lot of moving parts. So her team also leads real estate, whereas I mentioned, not only do we quote unquote have our own real estate footprint, but we also lease to other nonprofits. So that's a significant platform within the organization. And then she also leads our technology strategy, which is something that we're definitely going to invest in moving forward. A plug or shout out, we actually have a search underway for a CFO. So for anyone on this call, the process is well underway, but if you know any folks, there is a job description post on our website. Our CFO is phenomenal, but she's been real clear she's ready to retire. And then we also have on our leadership team a chief legal and ethics officer, lots of moving parts. And so I didn't speak as much about our advocacy arm, but we do have a sister organization that's Tides Advocacy, and which is a 501c4, lots of moving parts in terms of regulations around funding for C3s, C4s. So anyway, we have a legal team who manages all of that, as well as the complexity of a lot of our partnerships. And then I have a chief of staff who's the glue. She's the magic and the glue, who makes sure that all of this comes together in a fluid way, but also engaging our board on this journey as well.
That's great. Somebody just shouted out that they work at Tides Advocacy. They're listening in today. So that's
so we love our collaboration and partnership with Tides Advocacy. Absolutely.
That's great. So all right, so that's a lot of moving parts. I'm gonna have to take some time to process this. But I'm thinking about how even maybe more complex is you're sort of in the middle of this. I don't know if ecosystem is the right word, but where you're working with these funders, and these organizations who have their set ideas about giving, and then you've got the organizations that are in the trenches, doing the real work in the communities, the kind of work you're describing, and you're sort of in the middle, I guess, in some ways. So you've got not only all the moving parts you've got, but then you've also got these organizations out there. How do you advise funder partners? Let me try to focus it a little bit to evaluate their giving goals so that they really are aligning with the needs that you've identified. That's got to be a big piece of the work as well, I would think.
Well, and I will say to your point on that one, in terms of the needs that we've identified, and to some extent, quote unquote, it used to be that our funders were the ones to quote unquote kind of identify.
Mm-hmm.
But we now, as I mentioned, have a much bigger footprint. Our partners are expecting us now to have a more distinctive point of view of what could and should happen, if you will, around social impact, right? And so the role of our partnership team, I'll talk about the partnership team, and then again, the partnership team does also include the nonprofits and social ventures as well. There is this healthy, I'm going to call it healthy, tension between both sides of Tides, right? The folks who are in the trenches with the corporate partners and listening to them and responding to their needs versus, although I'd like to say, and the other side of our team who is focused on movement building and working on the ground, right? Or helping to enable and support, the social entrepreneurs, the change makers, the folks that are on the ground doing movement building. Or I saw someone did post something there about voter suppression efforts that are happening in Georgia and Florida. So last year was a heavy lift for our team that was quote unquote supporting that work, both Tides Network and Tides Advocacy, right? So there is indeed, and I'm going to say it's a healthy tension within our organization of having the conversations. And it's not about either side being more important. It's recognizing, quote unquote, the opportunities on both sides. So because of who we are from a social justice perspective, we're unapologetic about that as it relates to our corporate clients. So if a corporate partner wants to partner with us, they have to know here are our truths, right, as they relate to JEDI, right, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Here are our perspectives on climate justice, social justice, et cetera. So one of the things that we will do moving forward is to ensure that that voice is definitely recognized even more so by our corporate partners, right? And if, quote unquote, they have an appetite in that space, then we're the partner for them, right? So I will say most of our corporate partners do have an appetite, but they come to us because they may not know how to get there, right? And part of what we do is help you get there, right? And get there is around social justice, social change, et cetera. But the great news is we also know who on the ground is doing amazing work. Some of them are actually part of our family, right? And so there is this opportunity for those corporations, corporate partners, to then invest in these social ventures that are on the ground doing, and I sometimes say the real work, right? That's where the real change is happening, are these social ventures who are on the ground creating change, right? So anyway, part of our job though is to, quote unquote, connect the dots for the corporation, but also ensure that those that are on the ground are receiving the support and the respect that they also deserve.
Oh, that's all, huh? That's all. That's a lot.
Let me just say this, all this stuff, are we perfect at all of this? Not yet. We are, it's about progress, not perfection, right? I would not say that, quote unquote, we're getting it right every single day, but I will tell you, in terms of the folks who come to work at Tides, you don't come to Tides just because you want a job. We are not that, or if I just want a job, we are not that place. There truly is, right, a value that comes with coming to work at Tides around these particular issues.
And I actually like this idea, and I think somebody else mentioned in our chat as well, that idea of that tension that you described, that healthy tension. That's to me, that's always a good thing. It means the ideas get out there, people think about it, and then you progress and you move. So and then you'll become perfect eventually, but
Exactly.
then you resolve all those things. Wow. So just the thing you mentioned gets to a question that somebody asked here, which is about you really, which is what's the thing you look forward to most every day when you go to work? What's about all the things you talked about? Is there something that really just motivates you, inspires you?
Oh man, there's a lot. And I said this earlier, I don't go to work. So let me just say that what's hard for me is to turn this off, because it is truly aligned with my own truth and values, right? And North Star. And so that is a challenge in and of itself, because that means I'm going to take some of this work very personal. You know what I mean? Because it is not, to me, as I mentioned, a job per se. I think one of the things that gets me so excited though is, and this was some of the conversation we had with the board last week, it's about people, right? It's not like Tides is manufacturing products. It's really about people, right? And how do we enable people to create the biggest change possible, right? So that to me is what gets me super excited every day. Is I actually love the business of business, but I love the business of people, right? And having the opportunity to collaborate and partner with just incredible people who care about some of the same things I care about. But I will say one of the things that we adopted my first week as our mantra this year is kind of grace, pace, and space, right? Is that we got to give ourselves some grace in doing this work, and all of us come with baggage, right? We do come to work. We do come to Tides with baggage, right? And giving each other grace, right? In terms of how do we all still collaborate and find this quote unquote truth together and bring truth to power. Pace, because again, a lot of the issues that we're addressing are not ones that were created overnight. These are racism, just the climate. These are things that have unfortunately plagued, in some cases, this country forever. So giving ourselves some pace, making sure we pace ourselves. And then on, the other side is just space. And one of the things, again, of me getting excited about this role is that we've been spending quite a bit of time as of not late, but period. And we're going to integrate this into who we are, is space to really have those challenging conversations, space to heal, right? So when you think about what's been happening to the AAPI community is a couple of weeks ago, we just provided space for all of us just to quote unquote listen, right? Allowing our Asian and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters at times just to kind of share their truths, what they're scared about, right? Their beliefs around the work we do, et cetera. And for us to listen, right? It was just a hour for us just to listen. We did something very similar after the insurrection in January. We just had space, an hour the next day. And I mean, our Tidesters, we call them Tidesters, were crying, on the call, right? And some folks even, were chatting like, I've never worked anywhere where they allowed us to have this kind of space to bring our authentic truths to work, right? So anyway, the thing again, and I could go on, but what gets me most excited is the people that are really going to create this change, and the people more specifically at Tides.
So that's a sort of a lead into, well, there's a couple of questions here, and then one that I wanted to ask you too is these are, I guess, more advice questions. So that's what you're doing is really exciting. Obviously, it's something that I know. Just reading through the chats here, I can tell people are excited about what you're talking about. Do you have advice for someone who is interested in moving into this work, and whether it's nonprofit work or social justice work, and the kind of thing you're doing? Do you have thoughts about that? There's not really a clear path, I think, that's carved out in the way that there are for traditional kinds of work. So
yeah, I think there's a couple of opportunities. I see a chat here from my sister Juanita. Shout out to my sister Juanita.
She is.
One of those is to, as I mentioned before, I mean, I now can understand kind of how I got here better than say I could have maybe 20 years ago. And I think one of the things is there's something to be said just in terms of the authenticity. So the question I will often ask, and as I mentioned, we have a CFO search, is kind of your why, right? So in terms of coming to Tides or getting involved in this kind of work, kind of your why. And usually there's a story, right? For most people who want to get into this work, there's a story, whether there's an experience that, he, she, or they may have had, whether their family, whatever that is. But I do one thing say in terms of figuring out kind of where you want to play in this space. It is a broad space. Social impact is not one thing, right? Environmental impact is not one thing. So I think to me is in thinking about getting in this work, kind of what is that driving force, and what can you connect to in terms of your own kind of story that helps you, quote unquote, position yourself uniquely and distinctively, right? In terms of a particular opportunity. Two, in most people's cases, not all, they're usually, depending on where they work and what they do now, maybe they connect their soul to something outside of work in this space, and that is absolutely okay. So whether you're volunteering, whether you're on a board of a nonprofit, or it could be now, I mean, we blur, it could be a for-profit that is aligned with a particular cause, is still figure out, what I mean, how can you develop yourself and even become more informed on those issues that you care about, that then positions you for whatever organization. Three, I still say Tides is a business. We still need the same skills and resources at a for-profit. We have a CFO, we have a finance team, we have legal, right? So the good news is, I think for many folks, is to know that some of those things that you do at a for-profit company are transferable. We want the same level of excellence at Tides. And I know the same holds true for a lot of other organizations in this space. So I would never discount that those other functions and responsibilities are also of value when you come. So I know some folks want to be on the grant making side or whatever. That's great. But maybe you might think about the initial on-ramp being something aligned with what it is you do today from a skill or a expertise perspective, right? So anyway, I think there's a host of different ways. Or for some folks is, hey, if you are working at a company and there is an arm that is part of, that does social impact, environmental impact, is that a possibility, right? So if not actually moving into that particular department, have you ever just said, hey, can I partner with you? I know my job is over here, but I'd love to learn, or I'd love to shadow you, or I'd love to know more, right? Where you may not necessarily have the opportunity to work in that, but don't discount, again, the opportunity just to be mentored in some cases.
It's so encouraging to hear you say that, because we often have students who come to us and say, they wonder, do I have to suppress my personal values, or because I need to get a job and I want to move up in the world? And what you're saying is, no, there's a path for both, where you can have both. And that's so good to hear. In fact, that was one of the questions I had was advice for me, basically, at the School of Undergraduate Studies. How, one thing I don't know that we are able to always think about how to teach this. And especially our students, a lot of them have that commitment to social justice. A lot of them are based in the Bay Area, and it's something they think about every day. Um, and I think we struggle sometimes to figure out where does this go in the curriculum, right? How do you teach it? How do you cultivate it? I'm asking you this cold, so I don't know if you have any advice for me. But
Well, and let me just say this: you're asking me cold, but I do have a point of view. And
Okay.
one thing is, good news is, I am on the board of a university, Southern New Hampshire University. So I know the conversations we're having at the board level about kind of what is happening in the social impact space. In answering your question, one of the things I remember, I had this incredible conversation with a woman who's over the business school at University of San Francisco. So she and I were at Skoll World Forum in Oxford. Somehow, based on karma and all the right forces, we sat next to each other and just had this incredible conversation. And so one of the things I remember her saying, and she's the dean again of the business school, was, she's looking forward to the day where we don't have to say like social entrepreneurship, right? That inherent in entrepreneurship is the intent and the expectation of creating some type of social or environmental impact, period. And so she and I had this conversation, or I said, oh my God, I'm with you 100%. So when you think about a B school, at some point, it shouldn't be, I go to B school just for finance or whatever the thing, I'm just using that because my son is interested in business, and business school is that integrated into the business school curriculum should be something around purpose, right? Instead of this being separate, some other department, you know what I mean, is inherent in the expectation of business. This is Janiece's point of view. Let me just be clear.
This is good. This is
It
good.
should be an integration of capitalism and purpose, right? Not that it's not there at all, but it is not applied consistently. So that's one of the things where, whether it's Golden Gate leading or whatever, is that, how do you integrate these other things that are sometimes outliers, kind of sort of, into, you know what I mean, existing curriculum for the business school. I'll use that as an example.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of companies, and I have benchmarked in my last role as chief sustainability officer, kind of where companies are on their journey, right? Around sustainability, social impact, et cetera. And I'll say, one of the companies, and I mean, there's a lot, I don't want to say, there's a lot, I think, that are doing it right. One of the things, if you look at like a Nike, right? As you well know, Nike has an incredible platform to change lives, social impact, and they're using narrative and storytelling, right, as a part of their overall branding effort. Brilliant. Is it authentic? May not have started there, but it truly is, quote unquote, becoming more authentic now, right? In their in their ability to leverage platform. Even on the environmental side, they no longer have this kind of adjunct area called environmental sustainability. No, if you look at any Nike shoe, there's a part of that Nike shoe that has some type of sustainable element in it, right? So I use Nike as an example of a company in particular, right, who has figured out that their truth and their why is one that's also intended to be aligned with social and environmental impact. And so when I think about Golden Gate University or any university, what better platform than to, quote unquote, start pivoting towards how are we going to change the world, right? Regardless of what your major might be. And I kind of talked about the business school is,
Great.
Education is part of social justice, no ifs, ands, what is ultimately a game changer for any community, right? Especially say a community of color is 9 times out of 10, the conversation, or there's going to be a conversation about education. So when you think about what changes things in this country or even around the globe, education is definitely one of those levers, right? In terms of creating the type of change that we hope for.
Right. It's more than just the skills, as you're saying. No, I really appreciate that comment. Thank you. We just have time for one more question. There have been several really good ones in the Q&A, but unfortunately, we won't have the chance to get to them all, but I'll send them to you, and if you feel like answering them. But the one question here that I think really stands out is now that I'm hoping the pandemic is winding down, we're going to be out and about at some point, some of us sooner than others. How do you see the work that Tides is doing now? How do you see that, developing after the pandemic is over? What's going to be different? Are you going to go back to the way things were at all, or is it everything's going forward? Or
Yeah, I don't think any of us are going backwards. Let me say that. So one of the even in terms of our practices, right? As organization, we're having conversations now about the future of work, right? So similar to I'm sure everyone on this call, there is having this conversation about I don't want to say future of work, it's called future of whatever it might be. But we Tides are definitely having that conversation now. There's what will happen later on this year where we still are going to be uncomfortable a bit, right? Going back into an office space. So this hybrid model is something that we are currently creating, right? And then there's what happens even post, right? Whatever the new normal is on the other side of this. So, I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, but we are definitely right now evolving and pivoting our practices, around culture. What does that mean? That everyone's not in the same office, right? I mean, we do have a New York office that we have New York and San Francisco office, but more and more of our employees are going to be remote, right? So even as of the last couple of months, where before our hiring practices would have been San Francisco, New York, we have pivoted over the last 2 months saying, no, we want top talent anywhere. So depending on the opportunity or the role, if you're a senior advisor, we have quite a few senior advisors, we don't care where you are, right? If you are committed, to this work and interested, doesn't matter whether you're in the Bay, because our partners are everywhere. Our partners are not limited to East and West Coast. So anyway, the future will look very different from a culture perspective to some extent, just based on how things are evolving. And then in terms of our partners, again, we're extremely anxious right now in terms of solving these problems. So, the strategy work that we'll be doing this year will hopefully instruct us on what this chapter looks like on the other side of the pandemic from a prioritization perspective.
Yeah, no, it's still evolving. Wow. Well, Janiece Evans-Page, I'm CEO of Tides. I really want to thank you for taking the time to share what you're doing and how you got there. It's been a great opportunity to talk with you today. I do want to tell folks who are listening in, if you're interested in this will be posted on GGU's YouTube channel shortly, and you can share it with your friends, which I hope you'll do. Anyway, thanks to all of you, and Janiece, thanks again. It's been great having you on here today.
Thank you, and I apologize to all of you. I've been so involved in this conversation, I have not seen the chats. I saw one pop up, so I'm looking forward to seeing your chats and being a resource to many of you who are interested in this journey.
Yeah, and your website's tides.org if people want to find that and they can learn more about it.
It's not completely updated. Let me just say that. It will be by the end of the year, but it gives you some information. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So thank you all.
All right. Thanks. Take care. We'll see you all in a couple of weeks. We'll be doing a series on the arts and business coming up on GGU Presents. So stick around for that. Thank you.